La Escuela de Medicina y Ciencias de la Salud se fundó en Monterrey en el año de 1978, y es ahí donde está el Centro de Innovación y Transferencia en Salud, el Hospital San José y el Hospital Zambrano Elion. En Ciudad de México se encuentra la Unidad de Investigación de Enfermedades Metabólicas del Instituto Nacional de Ciencias Médicas y Nutrición, Salvador Subirán. En la ciudad de Guadalajara, el Centro de Ciencias de la Vida. En Chihuahua, la escuela es parte de Tec Salud, integrándose también el Hospital San José, Hospital Zambrano Elion, institutos y Fundación Tec Salud, formando un centro de atención, educación e investigación. Ser la mejor escuela de medicina y ciencias de la salud de Latinoamérica es nuestra visión, enfocándonos en bienestar, prevención y longevidad. Nuestros programas académicos: médico cirujano odontólogo, licenciatura en nutrición y bienestar integral, licenciatura en psicología clínica y de la salud y licenciatura en biociencias. 17 especialidades y subespecialidades médicas, 30 cursos de alta especialidad, una maestría y 2 doctorados. Nos caracteriza nuestro modelo educativo innovador, creando una experiencia transformadora con alianzas educativas en todo el mundo, 8 grupos de investigación con enfoque estratégico y más de 50 alianzas educativas en todo el mundo. Sociedades académicas para monitorear y apoyar a los alumnos, posicionándonos dentro de los primeros 5 lugares en el examen nacional para aspirantes a residencias médicas. Nuestros programas cuentan con acreditaciones nacionales que respaldan su formación, siendo la primera escuela privada que tiene convenio con la Secretaría de Salud del Estado de Nuevo León a través del programa multicéntrico. Y somos la única universidad privada en México que figura en el ranking QS de Medicina en Latinoamérica. Ahora que nos conoces, explora, elige, libera tu potencial transformador.
Buenos días a todos. Gracias por estar aquí hoy en este miércoles de sesión general. Bienvenidos. Les voy a recordar que vamos a tener la presentación y las preguntas se pueden hacer a través del chat y al final serán contestadas por nuestro ponente. Les pedimos, por favor, pongan su nombre completo en la pantalla para así poder tener sus datos completos, y les pedimos mantengan su micrófono silenciado durante la presentación y podamos llegar al final de la presentación sin ninguna situación. También es importante que nos ayuden llenando la encuesta de satisfacción que aparecerá en la liga en el chat o a través del QR al final de esta sesión. Bueno, sin más, en nombre de la Escuela de Medicina y Ciencias de la Salud del TEC de Monterrey, la verdad me complace mucho presentar continuar con esta serie de presentaciones sobre síndrome de Down. En esta ocasión tenemos a una invitada especial de Nationwide Children's. Ella es Anne Levine. Anne Levine is a clinical psychologist focusing on the neurodevelopment with the Child Development Center at Nationwide Children's Hospital and a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Pediatrics of the Ohio State University. She has completed fellowships in autism spectrum disorders and pediatric neuropsychology. Dr. Levine's clinical activities include sleep consultations and interdisciplinary evaluations, including children with complex medical history, autism, and other neurodevelopmental disabilities. She provides consultations to the neonatal intensive care, follow-up clinic, and develop a behavioral health clinic co-located in the follow-up clinic. She has the pleasure of training residents and fellows from psychology and medicine. Nos va ella a hablar sobre los servicios de desarrollo y comportamiento en los niños con síndrome Down, la importancia del comportamiento adaptativo y cómo se proveen estas intervenciones. Así que sin más, go on, Dr. Levine. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction. All right, so how do I'm going to share my screen because let's see. All right. I just want to make sure it was working before. All right, I have one disclosure, and that's I'm a member of the Autism Care Network. And what that is researchers, clinicians, and families work together to help provide care for children with autism. And really, today I'm going to be talking about the importance of assessing adaptive behavior and providing intervention. And I want us to think about why is it so important to work in intervening around adaptive behavior. And there's a saying, if you give a man a fish, he will be hungry tomorrow. If you teach a man to fish, he will be richer forever. And so really adaptive functioning is about teaching skills towards independence. Today, I'm going to be talking about adaptive functioning, the importance of parents, communication training, and teaching methods. This is from a parent who has a child with a disability. And she says the severity of one's disability does not determine their level of potential. The greatest barriers that persons with disabilities have to overcome are not steps or curbs, it's expectations. I think it's really important for all of us to think about that and realize that we may have biases towards our expectations when we see children with Downs. And I like to take a developmental standpoint of this is where the child is today. This is our snapshot today. Let's put in some interventions and see where development takes them. So what's adaptive functioning? It is really looking at the independence performance of daily activities that are required for personal and social sufficiency. And we know that, I should say in my opinion, adaptive functioning in some ways is almost more important than cognitive functioning because adaptive functioning actually leads to greater independence. Within adaptive functioning, we look at practical skills like self-care, toileting, cooking, cleaning, and then as somebody gets older, how do they care for one's home? What are their work skills? Look at social skills, both interactions and the ability to regulate one's emotions, and then conceptual skills like functional academics. Does a child understand what an exit sign means? What a bathroom sign means? Do they understand that a quarter is a quarter? And the concept of time. Those are all areas of adaptive functioning that we want to work on to help a child gain greater independence. We also know that the more developed a child's adaptive behavior is, the greater independence and the greater quality of life that they have. So another reason why we really want to focus in this area. Dahl in 1936 is thought to be the first person to recognize the significance of adaptive behavior. And then it took until the late 50s and early 60s for us to say, oh, adaptive behavior should be part of how we diagnose what we now call intellectual disabilities. Now it's important to think about variables that influence adaptive functioning. So first, a child has to have the opportunity to learn a skill. Then they have to have the opportunity to practice the skill, the motivation to use the skill, This is where cognition is important. They have to have the awareness that a skill is needed to be used in a situation. And we have to also look at physical or behavioral health challenges. So I often think about, for children with Downs, for instance, they have fine motor challenges, which then can create a barrier to dressing. If they have difficulty with zipping or zipping or buttoning or snapping. I think before we talk about adaptive functioning and interventions, it's important to review some behavioral challenges that are associated with Down syndrome, because these challenges can interfere with learning adaptive skills and using them. One thing that we know about children with Down syndrome is they have difficulty with motivation, difficulty persisting at tasks. And so if we're teaching them and they have difficulty persisting, it's harder for them to learn. And what we notice is that they get off task. They'll start talking about something or doing something that is not related to the task. Part of adaptive functioning is also social skills. A minority of children with Down syndrome have autism spectrum disorder. So we know that that's going to interfere with gaining social skills and also with their learning of social skills. Something else that's important to recognize about children with Down syndrome is that they are particularly sensitive to loss. And when they experience loss, you may see behavioral challenges. And loss not just associated with a death of somebody close to them, but it could be that their favorite intervention specialist is no longer working with them. Or it could be that a peer in their class has moved to a different class setting. Other behavioral challenges associated with the neurocognitive profile of a child with Downs is they have deficits in executive functioning. Executive functioning is often thought of as what an executive does: planning, organizing, revising, does this work or not work, judgment, and memory skills. We know that children with Downs often have working memory difficulties, so they don't hold on to information, and it's not going to then be consolidated in long-term memory. Also in the classroom, if somebody says, get your math book and take out a piece of paper, they may not hold on to that long enough to do that skill. Another thing is that children with Downs are impulsive. If they see something, they go for it. And that's why often you see that bolting behavior. It's not that they don't mean to follow directions of, oh, I'm supposed to sit still, but it is as if they are missing the stop sign and the judgment to say, oh, I need to stop and think about this before doing. It's also important to understand that language challenges can impact their learning of adaptive skills. Although their receptive or understanding of language is more developed, it's still a relative strength. And what I mean by that is generally it is weaker than their peers, and they have more difficulty expressing their thoughts. So they understand, yet they struggle with what they are thinking and feeling. And so if they're challenged by experiencing a feeling or a thought, and they cannot explain it easily, you may see it through behavior. So before moving on to assessing adaptive functioning, I'm not good about managing the chat. Any questions about that? Okay, so why assess adaptive functioning? It helps us determine intervention strategies in all the areas of adaptive functioning, like community, daily living, educational, social, and vocational purposes. It's very much parallel to what you do, like why assess blood pressure? because you have to get a baseline to then determine what, if anything, you're going to do in that area. The goals of assessing adaptive behavior, and this is really important to help families understand, is to determine if a child is going to qualify for services. Often they need a specific amount of deficits in order to qualify for services. Also helps establish a diagnosis, specifically an intellectual disability, and it allows us to understand their own strengths and weaknesses so that we can begin to inform intervention goals. There are some gold standard measurements that can be used with parents, teachers, and caregivers. And so this is a list of those measures. One of the things I will say is that some of these measures you can ask parents to fill out or a teacher to fill out. And then there are other forms where we actually are doing the interview and asking the questions. Often I find that the forms that are filled out are not, well, they're not as accurate often, and sometimes they can really be inaccurate. So if you are going to give for a parent to fill out, you have to ask yourself, what is their level of understanding if they're going to be reading this? And do you think they can accurately capture their child? You may also get very different reports between school and home. That may be because school provides structure and home doesn't. Or it may be that at home, parents are actually doing the skill for the child. And this can be difficult for families to understand. I often say, I want to understand what your child is doing, not what you know they can do. And the example I'll give is, your child can drive at 16. So if they're 8, they cannot do that. They are not doing that skill. Whereas I'll say, you may know that they can make their bed, but are they doing it on a regular basis? Because what we want to know is the skill functional? It's not enough if they can do it, but that they are doing it. Then there are measures where you directly assess the child in different areas. The assessment of functional living skills starts at the age of 2 and goes through adulthood, whereas the next assessment on basic language and learning skills starts at 0 and goes through the age of 12. Why are parents so important? Of course, they're important because they love their children. They are the strongest advocate for their children. But they also are amazing teachers to their children. So one of my favorite quotes is, children are educated by what the grown-up is, not by his talk. Parents naturally display skills. And so this picture really shows how a parent is clapping and then the child is imitating that clap. What parents do to support building independence, they encourage independence. They give their child chores to practice. They're going to give them praise while their child is practicing those skills. It is important for parents to understand what the school is working on so that they can then integrate that at home to practice and then to find opportunities in their community to practice social activities. So when you're meeting with families, it's really important to listen to, do parents give their child the opportunity to practice skills? So often what I hear is, it's just easier to dress my child than to ask them to do the dressing because it takes so much longer. Sometimes you have behavioral challenges, but we know that children with Downs need more time to practice the skills. Partly they need more time to practice because most children with Downs will have an intellectual disability, so learning takes longer. So I will try to work with families on what would it be like if you woke your child up half hour earlier to give you both a cushion so that they could practice dressing. And initially, maybe it's practicing just putting on pants. And then once they master that, it's putting on a shirt. And then also talking with them about praise and reinforcement, like helping the child understand, gosh, once your pants are on, then you get to do a favorite activity for 5 minutes. I now want to talk about communication. We know that children with Downs often have communication impairments that interfere with them participating, learning, and the ability to express emotions, wants, and needs. Most children with Downs should receive intervention to enhance their communication skills. And when I talk about communication, I'm not just talking about language, I'm talking about in functional ways, how can they communicate their feelings, their wants, and needs. So there are several ways to do communication training. And this is more just for you to be aware of these interventions, not necessarily for you to be doing these. These are often done by educators. One is applied behavioral analysis, specifically with verbal behavior. One of my favorites is sort of the naturalistic learning around communication. So if a child wants to go outside and play and it's cold out, it makes sense that they have to put their coat on to go outside. And that's a way of communicating. I'm putting on my coat to indicate I want to go outside, but I'm also practicing an adaptive skill, which allows me to be more functional, more independent. So it's what's happening in their environment. You use those teaching moments. And there's something called functional communication training, and that is to understand what the meaning, the communication of the behavior is. Behavior often has 4 meanings. It is either you want to escape from a task, you want attention, you want something tangible, or you actually gain pleasure from a sensational. So what I mean by that is a child could be hitting their face. We need to understand, is that because they're not wanting to do an educational moment because what we're asking them to do is too difficult? So they want to avoid the task. Is this that they want someone's attention and they know if they do this, that somebody's going to come over and give them attention? Is it they're hitting themselves because they know somebody's going to come over and want them to stop hitting? So they're going to say, do you want this toy? Do you want this activity? Or do they like the feel of hitting themselves? So there's a very specific technique used to understand the meaning of the communication around behaviors like this. It's called a functional behavioral analysis. And so these interventions are ways to help understand the meaning of communication and then to teach kids more functional ways to communicate. The ABA way is going to work most on language, you know, the actual expression of language. Let's talk about teaching adaptive skills in addition to communication. So several methods, and I'll talk more about this, is behavior chaining, prompting strategies, modeling, and visual supports. This all comes from the world of behavioral interventions. I want to start by thinking about a case. So Harry Potter is 13 years old. He has Down syndrome and mild intellectual disability. He was given the WISC, which is an intellectual test, and his overall IQ is 56. So his overall cognitive abilities are below the first percentile compared to peers his age. And he has a relative strength at the 7th percentile for graphomotor processing speed, which means he can copy with a pencil quickly. Now we're going to look at his adaptive skills. Excuse me. His adaptive skills are similar to his overall cognitive skills. Sometimes you see a significant difference. I would say if you are seeing a child with Downs and autism, often their cognitive skills may be stronger than their adaptive skills. But what we see for Harry Potter is that overall, his skills in different areas within adaptive functioning are below the first percentile. So these are, I then wanted to talk about, so what are some interventions that we would begin to think about based on adaptive skills? One is in regards to communication. We want to take Harry Potter into the community, and we want him to get used to doing activities that other children his age may be doing, but also taking into account where he is developmentally. So he really likes cars. So we might take him to talks about cars, such as at the car museum, and also talks that have visual effects, because language is a weakness. So being able to see as well as hear is going to help him understand. And in order for him to be successful, it might be that we only take him to a talk initially for 5 or 10 minutes and then leave. But he has that success, and then we build on it. Also, in helping him with communication, we want him to be able to retell a story. So we're going to use picture cues, and we're going to help him sequence and elaborate it by using picture cues and also by prompting. So what's the first thing about this story? Let's say it's about a car. And so if Harry doesn't answer, then we're going to take the picture and start the sequence. And these are activities that parents can do, as well as talking to parents about meeting with their child's teacher. And if that in the school, they have a speech language pathologist and a physical therapist or an occupational therapist, to say, what's one thing that you're doing at school that we can also practice at home? If they are using picture cues, it's very helpful for everybody to use the same set of pictures so that there's continuity across environments initially. Also, expanding written communication. So helping Harry by using pen and paper or a computer. Initially, we might start with him dictating sentences, very short sentences, and then copying them so that we're going to decrease his frustration. And again, I would want to work with the speech language pathologist, maybe the OT, to make sure he has the fine motor skill. It may be that he's a kid who does better with having an adaptive pencil. And then also, is it that we need to use paper where he has more space to write? So, you have thin line paper, but maybe we need thick line paper, for instance. daily living skills. So this is independence in the world. This is an interesting study where they worked with children from the ages of 7 to 9, had mild intellectual disability, not necessarily Downs, working with them on learning how to cross the street. And they used typically developing children to help train the children with mild ID. And they did this by social stories. So in other words, reading a story about how to cross the road, modeling by showing them, and then giving them feedback about learning how to cross the road safely when they practice this. I would also say, I think it would be interesting to do video modeling where we actually videotape the peer model crossing the street. And then we have a child, the child learning to cross the street where we videotape it. Now, one of my concerns for a child with Down syndrome is what we call, and I mentioned before, sort of bolting because of impulsivity. So if they see something that's very interesting across the street, are they going to stop and look both ways before crossing the street? I think we have to be very careful about teaching this skill. And it may be that we have to do it in a modified way. Like they are always going to cross the street with someone, but they can demonstrate the skill. Or, you know, like on a certain day, I don't know, a street's blocked off for a certain reason to traffic. And that's when the child does it. But we have to think about overall the neurocognitive profile of the child. But I was very excited to see this study. And I think it suggests that there will be some children who are able to independently cross the street at times. Now, I will also say, going back to this, that there have been studies teaching children that have more severe intellectual disability. And what they learned from the studies was that, I'm going to sneeze, I apologize. Maybe not. Okay. That those children, although they initially showed the skill, were not able to continue to hold on to the skill and essentially felt like they had not yet found a way for children with more moderate to severe ID to independently cross a street. And the other thing for this 13-year-old child, Harry, is the importance of learning the function of money and when to use it. So again, embedding training opportunities in the real world. So at the store, have Harry give the cashier money and take change. We might want to take Harry early in the morning when there aren't a lot of other people around so he can practice this. Also for Harry, we might want to begin to introduce the idea of the concept of money more explicitly, like you have two kinds of chocolates. One is much more expensive than the other, beginning to try to help introduce that concept of different brands cost more or less, and then seeing about him beginning to understand coins, bills, and their values. Teaching the concept of time, many different ways to do this. Initially, we want to use words like before, after, next, later, until, yesterday, today, tomorrow. Also introducing the idea of how long does it take to do something? And then to help a child understand time, to make it visual can be helpful. Whether it's a sand timer, which usually lasts about a minute. There's also visual apps where a child can see, oh, there's getting to be less and less time until this activity is over. A visual schedule, which allows a child to see, first I'm doing, let's say first I'm doing reading, then I'm going to the playground, then I'm coming back into my classroom, then I have music, so that they can see the day, for instance. There's something called a finish basket, and that is perhaps a child is doing an activity, and when they're done, they put it in a basket to signify it's done, it's finished. The idea of helping a child learn about the concept of time is something we can do every day. Then socialization. Helping Harry express emotions across environments. It may be using pictures and how are you feeling right now, for instance. Also experiencing outings in the world, like a restaurant, a movie, structured time, a structured sort of play date with a peer in their home. I will say, I think all of us globally are struggling with what are socialization skills going to look like due to the pandemic, and how has that impacted development for all kids? And I think we are in the moment. We don't know the final answer. Also, if there are structured athletic activities for children with disabilities, that is a great opportunity to practice many skills. Here in the States, there's something called the Miracle League, which is baseball, and each child is assigned a coach. And so each child works with a coach playing baseball. And then they do activities together with all the other children, families, and coaches. I don't know if there's something similar to that in your area. Okay, so now I'm gonna shift. Harry Potter was 13 and had more skills. Now I wanna shift to some other skills like hand washing. Hygiene skills are really important to work on, as it reduces the burden to caregivers, promotes independence, and then the benefits of public health and personal health, especially given the pandemic. Barriers to kids with Downs learning personal hygiene, gross and fine motor difficulties, some cognitive difficulties like sequencing, attending, memory planning. Also, if they have any sensory issues, like they don't like the feel of water on their hands, communication difficulties, and then that challenging behavior, such as, are they going to persist to finish the task? Most self-care skills are actually learned between the ages of 2 and 6 years of age for typically developing children. So we need to understand first where a child's skill level is prior to intervention. This is just sort of developmentally a chart of when typically developing children demonstrate these skills. So we use a task analysis to decide how to teach a skill like hand washing. We're going to break the steps down into a series of simple steps. So for instance, for brushing teeth, you're going to pick up the toothbrush, remove the cap from the tube. Oh, and then the other one is rinse off the toothbrush. So first, you've got to do things like turn on the water, wash and rinse the toothbrush, turn off the water, pick up the toothpaste. There are many steps to think about within all of these steps. Fine motor, can they turn on the tap water? Do they understand hot and cold? Can they twist the cap off? But this is how we break down a task. We may teach one part of brushing teeth, and then We are going to do the rest of the tasks with support. Once they master the first of the sequence, then we teach the next task within the sequence. Here's one for hand washing. You stand in front of the sink, you scrub your hands for 20 seconds, you turn off the water, might turn it back on. Personally, I just leave the water on for kids, but this again breaks down the task. The other thing is, here's another way to show it, a picture schedule. So you're gonna stand in front of the sink, you turn the faucet on hot. You can use real pictures, or you could use drawings, depending on the child's cognitive level. Visual interventions. So things you need to think about are the visual supports. To remember, how long do I need to scrub my hands? It might be teaching them a song to sing, saying the ABCs. We might be modeling it. We're going to reinforce by saying, great job, high five, especially for children with Downs. They really love praise. And then also prompting. So what's next? If they don't respond to the verbal cue, I might point at what I want them to do. I might use a gesture to, again, support their learning. So you want to identify the skill, identify the child's current level of skill, and what are the prerequisite skills needed to complete the task, and think about all the materials needed to teach the skill. Most importantly, you have to practice, practice, practice. That's the only way you're going to really learn the skill. I talk to parents about, if you were going to run a marathon, you have to practice, practice, practice. Limited real-life practical abilities interfere with a person's ability to be independent in daily activities. So again, think about when that parent is in your office. How can you remind them to think about what's one thing they can practice with their child every day? Doesn't have to be very long, but we want to give them something that they feel like they can be successful with. Planning. I'm going to run through this quickly because I have 5 minutes left. It's important that everyone working with the person should be able to support the learning of the skill to provide consistency. Family members and caregivers should be included in developing the treatment plan, only address a few behaviors at a time, and interventions need to be individualized. Just like medicine needs to be individualized, interventions around adaptive functioning needs to be individualized based on the child's skill level and interfering behaviors. We want to make it meaningful. So in other words, when they're learning cooking, that's a time to talk about fractions. Learn to count change when you're buying something. Instead of making it abstract, we want to help the child understand how it applies to the real world. Okay, transition planning. It's really important for families and schools to begin to plan for students' transitions in the real world. So we want to do this a number of years before they're actually leaving school. Usually between the ages of 13 to 15, we are thinking about what behaviors are needed for work, exposing them to different work environments, increasing chores in the home, providing opportunities for the child to make decisions and learn from success and failure, continuing to practice functional math and reading skills, and we want to promote appropriate behaviors at home and elsewhere. At 16, and this is in the States, we develop a 5-year plan to address educational, vocational, and independent living skills, because children that have disabilities in the States can go to school through the age of 21. Their educational plan, which is an IEP in the States, needs to address all areas of skill development, and the child, along with parents, should attend those meetings because they are becoming older and they need to become part of the plan. We also want to think about how can a child get practice at getting a job and practice self-advocacy skills. Ongoing concerns. Children with intellectual disabilities, like many kids with Downs, are more likely to remain in poverty compared to children without ID. Here, there is little emphasis placed on supporting the needs for students who have profound or severe ID. So as a result, they have greater need for support through their lives. And this is just something I think we all need to think about. Tell me, I forget. Teach me, I remember. Involve me, I learn. So I feel like I did a very quick overview. I'm going to get out of here. And I welcome comments, questions, whatever makes sense.
Thank you, Dr. Levine, for this excellent presentation. I'm sure this is going to be really helpful for our practices from now on. And I'm going to let Juan Francisco to ask you some of the audience questions so you can answer to them. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Likewise.
All right, Anne. So one of the questions is, how do you move the conversation from normalizing a child development to obtaining more like adaptive behaviors, independence? So I think the question goes more like from making sure a kid talks to what you were saying, like giving communication skills. So how do you talk to a parent about that?
So very good question. And it's one of the things that I always start with is just checking myself about how comfortable am I talking about it? Because if I'm concerned about talking about it, I'm worried that I am suggesting to the parent like that, you know, I'm afraid of it, so you're going to be even more afraid of it. And what I start with is, of course, all of us want Harry Potter to be able to be verbal and to communicate easily. Often we know when a child has difficulties using language to communicate, their behavior, there are more behavioral challenges because that's the only way they can tell us they're struggling. I really want to help you and Harry Potter have less struggles. So we are always going to hope for more language and more meaningful language, but I'm really interested in helping him communicate. And there, you know, sometimes that's using signs. Now, I know that families are very concerned that if we start signs, that's going to delay talking. Actually, research suggests that that's not true. Also, we want to start in the easiest way for your child to be successful in communicating. So what I might do in supporting communication initially is pick up something your child really likes and something you know your child doesn't like. Hold them both up and say, what do you want? And whether they point or look at what they want, that's communication. They're letting us know their needs and wants, and that's where I start. And then I would say, in order to help your child communicate and for you to continue to understand their wants and needs, a speech language pathologist can really help with that. Sometimes it's with signs, sometimes it's with some sort of technological device. So again, we are going to hope for the best, but we're going to start with where your child is at. And then I sit back and say, what is that like to hear? What are your concerns about that?
I mean, I think that's a, oh, sorry. That's a really nice approach to it. And I think following that line, there's a similar question. We were talking about in this one, like normalizing, from changing that expectation from talking to communicating. This one goes more like cognitive. So from them seeing their kid as, having more cognitive abilities that we probably see in our assessments. Like they might see the kid recite the numbers, but they're not counting. So again, how do you have those conversations of coming into probably reality of where we are, and focusing our shift of, he needs to continue learning all of these things, more academic, from more daily living. Yes. Yeah.
So I remind myself first that every family is on their own journey. And so it takes some families longer than others. I also am reminded by parents in the NICU who always say things like, you don't celebrate what we're celebrating. Like they moved their fingers and held a rattle. And you're talking about all these problems. So it's very important for us to embrace a strength, whatever that may be, even though it's atypical for development. And I wouldn't embrace the strength of numbers if we're sort of shifting to helping them with functional, but it might be, I really liked how she came in today and looked at me, or how nicely she sat while I looked in her ears, just because it makes a parent feel good. I talk about, I understand you're talking about how she's doing all of these things, and that is wonderful. My concern is that she's not doing it across all settings. And so she's not using it in a consistently functional way. And so I want to help her with where she's at now and stretch her to the next step. That doesn't mean I'm giving up on what you're saying, but also I want to think about where she is now in most settings so she doesn't get frustrated. And the way that I see her skills, I do two things. One is I want to know if there are other kids in the family. If there are, how does that child compare to other children in the family? How are they similar and how are they different? Because sometimes that's an opening of, oh yeah, my 10-year-old, when they were 8, were able to do this, this, and this, and this child isn't. Or my 4-year-old is doing more than this, this, and this. So that sometimes is a window. The other thing I do is I talk about, I want you to just think about this for now. When I'm talking about delays in development, often what that means is the following. If you imagine getting on the highway and you're driving at a consistent speed, in the States, it's 55 miles an hour, and another car gets on at 55 miles an hour, but then speeds up to 70. Over time, they're going to be much farther ahead of you. That gap gets wider and wider. And so that's also sometimes what we see, or not sometimes, I would say that's often what I see with a child who has the delays your child has. Again, we're going to work on where you are today, but I also feel it's my responsibility to let you know sort of that development takes longer, and because it takes longer, there's a greater divide. It may feel like I'm giving up when I say we need to work on these other things, But I also know that working on these other things will allow your child to be more independent. It's a hard discussion to have. Sometimes it's going very slowly. Sometimes it's, and I understand if you want to talk to other people about this. How can I be helpful? Sometimes I say, gosh, it seems like we're going to agree on these things and we see these things differently, and that's okay. But what we do agree on is that we're all here to work on helping your child with development.
Yeah, and definitely, I mean, it's a tough conversation to have, but I think it's a nice approach of doing it this way, especially for general pediatricians that, I mean, they are that first contact. They've had a long relationship with the family, so that counts a lot for them. And they can come to see a specialist, but they will, a lot of times they return to their pediatrician for validation, to confirm that whatever they heard is the right choice. So that's what a lot of our population do, of going back. So I think that, even though it can be hard and sometimes we relate things to a specialist, we need to be aware that we also need to have those conversations and put things on the ground of where we are, how to approach it. So I think that's a nice way of doing it.
And the other thing to recognize is that when you are the first person giving difficult news, that sometimes the family may be upset and angry at you. And it's not personal, it's just, this is so hard to understand, and you're the person telling me this. And I think just acknowledging and not fixing, but thinking about, okay, so how do we support your child moving forward? And respecting that they are able to share those feelings. And it's going to change over time, especially the pediatrician, because you do have that ongoing, consistent relationship.
Well, and I think those were our questions. We summarized them because there were some that were somehow similar, but I think we've appreciated your time and having this different perspective of shifting from a medical aspect to more adaptive and behavioral. So thank you again.
Thank you so much. And we all learn from each other. Take care, you guys. Have a lovely day. Thanks so much. Bye now.
Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay. Gracias a todos por haber estado aquí. Los esperamos el próximo miércoles. Háganos favor de llenar las cuentas de satisfacción y que tengan una buena semana. Saludos.